Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to the final episode in our HR High Performance series. I'm your host, Lucinda. I think you might know me by now, but if this is your first time of listening to the HR Uprising podcast, thank you so much for joining in on episode 269. Feel free to go back and check out the others, or at the very least, the other 9 episodes in this HR High Performance series. Together, we've looked at the building blocks of high performance from an HR point of view, the things that we can influence, from setting goals and giving feedback, from performance management, from recruitment to developing talent, creating a learning culture, psychological safety, reward and recognition, you name it. We've looked at lots of things across the series, and hopefully you found it practical, because that's always my aim, to give you some practical tools and resources and levers that you and people managers can use every day to shape positive outcomes. Now, that's why we've left the best, the most nebulous to last. The reality is, underpinning everything we do strategically, tactically, the processes that we find, underpinning whether or not our efforts stick, is organisational culture. Culture is so hard to define. It defines how our people show up. It defines what they prioritise, how aligned their actions are, the values they promote. It defines whether they're likely to help people or be unhelpful. It's something that's really intangible but makes such a massive difference. So in this final episode, we're going to explore how we can influence the culture in our organisation. From a performance and development point of view, it's so important, but it also is key for compliance. And that's something we're going to weave into this episode, because it's something we're involved in more and more, because culture is no longer a nice to have, it's a regulatory expectation. And one of my pieces really in terms of HR high performance is, how can we often aren't the decision makers, but we're massive influencers, and we can help make things happen that should happen. And often those are the things like compliance, where we can bring the people along to something that's important and should be, inherent in an organisation's culture. How do we define culture? I'm sure you've all heard the classic definition, and I think it's Peter Senge, but if I've got it wrong, please write in and correct me. It's often defined as the way we do things around here, which is pretty simple way of defining things. So as I was saying to you earlier, in terms of the examples, it's whether we have an environment where people work late because they feel they should, it's presenteeism, or whether we reach out and volunteer, or we help others, we go the extra mile. When you think about it in terms of employee engagement, which we do all look at measuring, although culture isn't overtly mentioned, culture is definitely something which will be influencing how people feel at work and whether or not they're engaged, because you have a management culture, a people management culture, a performance management culture. That is all going on in terms of, so how do managers really value one-to-ones, for example, and give good quality feedback and are quite, passionate about getting the best out of their people? Or do they pay it lip service? Is it something that they do because they have to do? Whichever way they are will be a reflection of your people management culture, which is a subset of your organisational culture, and that will play into employee engagement. It will also play into compliance in terms of our learning culture. So one of the ways I think is quite interesting is culture is the way people behave when no one's watching. And that's even more interesting when we think about a hybrid environment. So are people sort of logging on and staying logged on because they're scared of being found out? Or are people feel comfortable to go off and walk the dog, or they feel trusted that it's a culture of outputs? It's not the values on our website, it's how people make decisions, treat others, and respond to challenges in the real world. And if we want to drive high performance, or whatever we put in place when we've talked about the different ways of driving and supporting high performance, we are either pushing against the tide or we're going with it. And the tide in this case is culture. So we have to be able to influence that. So if we're thinking about how we map culture, because culture, I kind of think it's almost like air, it's all around us. It's how do we make the invisible visible? And there are things that you can do to try and understand or diagnose your culture more. And you can look at where the culture is aligned and where it's drifting. You can also do it in terms of culture change. In fact, those of you who are familiar with my book, How to Be a Change Superhero, there's a number of culture change resources in there. So you've got, and there's a free toolkit that I'll put in the show notes that you can download, sign up and download the Change Superhero toolkit. That actually has got Cameron and Quinn's cultural diagnostics, so you could analyse whether or not the culture fits with what you're trying to do. So for example, if you're in a very entrepreneurial space but the behaviours within your organisation are really bureaucratic and slow and rigid and unflexible, then that might be a mismatch. So that's a useful tool you can look at. The other tool is the cultural web, and that diagnoses 7 aspects in which you can think about your culture. And for example, things like what are the symbols of culture? What are the processes in your organisation? And you can map where you are currently, and you can map what you'd like to be. So you can use that to work out where is your culture aligned with where you want to be, and where do you want to shift it. Other information that you'd want to do for those mapping is you might not know the information directly. So as HR professionals, you could map the culture by doing things like focus groups or interviews where you explore what it's like for someone to work remotely in your organisation or to work in a specific department. How do they feel about it? Obviously, you can get similar data from things like engagement surveys, but I can think of examples where there's been suspicions of, this is a negative example, of maybe a bullying culture, and focus groups were really important to get specific examples of why it was seen as a bullying and harassment culture, and they got quotes from people about microaggressions and sort of things that were said in banter but actually were making people feel the culture was negative. So focus groups are really powerful in terms of gathering real examples of how people feel to work in your organisation. You can obviously look at other data content such as performance data, other trends in behaviours. Simplistically, does one area of your organisation do performance reviews regularly and another not do them at all? Do you have exit interview insights where there are repeated strengths or negatives that flush things out, that give red flags that you can then explore further? You can think about making sure that your company values are discussed in performance reviews, or are you making sure that or you do things like 360 feedback to see whether leaders are seen to model the values, or whether they're paying lip service to them. So all of those metrics and tools will give you data that can help you map things. Obviously, pulse surveys and engagement surveys are also really useful to see where culture is strong or strained. And you might even see that you've got different cultures in different departments, or you've got a scenario where people are misaligned. So they're kind of pulling against each other, they're competing. So any of those are really useful for us to map where we are. And if you then want to set metrics as to how you're going to develop the culture, you can use Actus Performance for looking at the data in terms of performance insights, or our new product, particularly useful if you're in financial services, but it's not just restricted to that, Actus Oversight, which allows you to sort of set metrics as an organisational point of view for you to track and improve performance, and you can then check progress against it and disseminate accountability. If you want to know more, check out the website. So if you want more information on cultural mapping, which is almost your way of diagnosing, because we know we want to be high performance HR, therefore we look at things from a diagnostic point of view. Data is valuable. So that's how you could map where you are currently. And then if you want to plan changes that will go into things that we could do differently, then you can then use this same data to reflect on whether it's changed or not. Things are changing all the time. We all know that. And that means we all need to be responsible for our own learning and development. Culture directly affects whether or not learning takes hold. If people don't know the why, or they're just going through your classic, the compliance is another great example here, where people are going through annual compliance training and they're literally just scrolling through it, just getting the test at the end. It's not living. And the culture is, you've just got to do this, it's tick box. Then that's not going to provide people with the knowledge that's needed. And when you think about compliance training, it's being done for a reason. It's not being done so that a compliance officer doesn't get into trouble with the regulator, although that is how it feels sometimes. It should be done in a way where it's taking hearts and minds on the journey. It's being done in the way to make a difference. And I'll talk about that more with one specific type of compliance as an example. But fundamentally, the best training content or systems won't create impact without having an environment where people feel psychologically safe to speak up, to make mistakes, to ask silly questions or try new things. So they need to feel sufficiently safe that learning's is the right thing to do, that it's all right to ask a silly question. And one of the best ways for that to happen is if you have leaders who are prepared to be curious and vulnerable, and to also say, I don't know, what do you think? And feedback, all of these three work harmoniously together. If you create an environment where feedback is positive, endemic, it's business as usual, cultural. It's cultural. So if you've done something right, you're told exactly what it was you did right. If you've done something that could be better, you're given pointers as to how it could improve. You're not castigated for getting things wrong. And that's one of the things that really makes a difference in terms of high performance organisations. You'll know from previous episodes. But those are the sort of things that we can create learning and development culture by encouraging people to be really comfortable with feedback, not have that fight or flight response to it. Actually, an example of that is Project Aristotle, it was called, I think, by Google. And they said that psychological safety was the top factor in terms of generating high performance teams. So if your culture isn't creating psychological safety, that has to come down to individual line managers, learning isn't going to translate to performance. And one of the things I think about learning is also bringing learning to life in terms of psychological safety, to hear lived experience, to share real life examples. That's really powerful. And people learn more from that than they will do from e-learning any day of the week. So I mentioned before that regulatory compliance is an increasing thing, and increasingly regulators like the FCA are looking at culture as a risk. But it's not just financial services, although that's quite a topic that we've been involved in recently. Think about the hospitals. Think about that awful Lucy Letby case. Culture was seen, the culture of fear was seen as one of the reasons that the issues weren't flagged earlier, that she actually was able to kill so many babies. So culture makes a massive difference. And we've also heard of that in other public sectors, like the police having what they call a culture of endemic racism. Those are all going to be reasons where people are not going to speak up. They're not going to whistleblow. That's at the one end of the scale, but we're not talking about whistleblowing. What we want to do is people to do the right thing, business as usual. We want to create a positive culture. And therefore, it's trying to make sure that people are motivated to do it for the right reasons. So looking at the financial services, they've got a regulation called Consumer Duty, which has been out for a couple of years. And that whole concept of this is that the firms need to show that they're not just delivering decent, or they're not delivering bad outcomes. They need to be showing that they are culturally improving outcomes, and that they therefore are delivering great customer outcomes and looking to raise the bar regularly, and that culture, behaviour and accountability are aligned to that. So that would mean the compliance values are embedded in day-to-day decisions. They're part of the processes that take place. And that's I've done a webinar on this about how you can embed compliance into HR processes. It is a real key collaboration. Making sure that staff do the right thing even under pressure. And that means that it's modelled and leaders are not just saying that being compliant is important because they'll get into trouble with the regulator. They're saying it's important because it's the right thing to do, that it's aligned with our values. And those sort of things are how you measure an evidence culture, not just policies, by really making sure you're taking hearts and minds with it. And that has to be led from the top, and that has to be embedded in process to make it work. Otherwise, it's tick box. And it's really easy for leaders to unintentionally undermine compliance or any other thing like that by just demonstrating that they don't buy into it, not giving it, not paying attention to it in a powerful way. So what can we do? After all, this is the HR Uprising podcast. How can we help build culture? Well, we are absolutely the enablers of culture. We can't control culture. Actually, no one can. But as often we're leaders in the organisation, not necessarily with the positional power all the time, although some of us do, but we're definitely influencers of others. And one of the key things I would say is we are usually able to see where leaders may not be modelling the right behaviours, and we may not always feel comfortable calling it out. But if you read my book, How to Be a Change Superhero, I talk about courage being one of the key superpowers. That is definitely something to call people out in a constructive, discreet way, but build awareness with your leaders. Maybe do 360 feedback with them if they are so unaware that they're not modelling the right behaviours. But you're the key. You're the key to helping that culture be improved or reinforced if it's positive. Other ways in which we affect culture, well, recruitment, performance management, L&D, as I've mentioned, those, and collaboration. So if we looked at recruitment and onboarding, we can try and recruit for values rather than skills. You can do things like scenario-based onboarding, which by giving scenarios to check how someone's values line up or the conduct expectations. Actually, I've got an interesting example that I came across the other day on this, which is nothing to do with financial services. One of my university friends' daughter has just graduated and is going to go and do a ski season. She's a beautiful young lady, and she got through to final interview. And the final interview was all about scenarios. And one of the scenarios was you are hosting a group of corporate men, and one of them brushes past you or touches your backside in the kitchen. What do you do? And another scenario was it's a family there, mother, father and kids, and the father appears to be being abusive to the mother or the kids. What do you do? Proper scruples stuff. Now, I'm not going to comment on what the right or wrong answer were. In fact, I don't exactly know what they were looking for because I was just interested in the description of the interview process. But I thought it was quite powerful for them to work out whether this person's going to be a good fit for the brand. And the brand is to create great customer service, to be highly professional, and how do you present yourself, and how do they also keep you as an individual safe. So interesting there in terms of that. And obviously we can adapt scenario-based onboarding when we're recruiting people coming into our organisations to get them with the right values and natural values, because you can't really change people's natural values. You want to get people who already align, and then they're much likely to do well in your organisation, or certainly align with the values you want to have. And we need to make sure that people feel safe from the start to make mistakes, to ask questions. We know how hard it is, particularly if people are brought on board remotely, to get up to speed with things because you don't feel able to ask a buddy. So how do you make it as accessible as possible for people to be able to get support early on? Performance management, of course, the full performance management cycle, that is so useful in terms of embedding various goals. Whether it's aligning with values, you can incorporate it in, whether it's incorporating elements of compliance, if you're financial service, things like conduct and certification, all of those things can be usefully captured through performance management. And I've done loads of content on that, so I don't need to go that further. Learning and development, how can we make sure that the training is really relevant and role specific? And then people are going to find it more engaging. Again, storytelling to show ethical decision making in action. I love the idea of also people learning from each other, getting around a table and talking about What was your experience in such and such a way? Or how would you handle if a customer says this to you? What would you say? Because we're humans, right? It's really nice to learn from other humans, and it's so much more powerful and resonant because it comes with emotion when you hear it from somebody. And do we look at things like micro-learning or just-in-time prompts to reinforce behaviour, as opposed to sheep dip training that people have got to go through even when they know it, and it's just grunt through it. They're not teaching them anything, and what that's really doing is devaluing the message that training is supposed to be delivering. The other thing we can do is enable collaboration. So how can we make sure there's alignment across departments? People are not pulling against each other in terms of goals and objectives, that we need to make sure they fully align. You can look at data to identify if there's cultural red flags in certain pockets, and work with your compliance, because compliance is one of the, maybe not L&D, but as they sit under the HR, one of the other key areas where if you work together, you've got real power. And it's almost like the compliance is what we need to do, but the people bit is why and how we do it, and how do we then wrap it into process. If you wrap it into process, it's repeated enough, then it's likely to develop into culture. So culture isn't something that we as HR can own on our own, but we are absolutely key facilitators of it. Moving on, we can't ignore the role of leaders. So we can't control our leaders, but I've already touched on a few areas where, leaders really do create the culture. It's almost the leadership shadow sets the tone. If leaders say one thing but reward another, then it shouts. It doesn't speak louder, it really does shout. And so if people do as I say, not as I do type leadership, or they turn a blind eye to poor behaviour, particularly if it generates money, or they're very short-term focused as opposed to long-term values-driven things. So they do things because you have to do it, or it raises the most money, and as opposed to it being the right thing to do. So that's really tricky if you've got leaders demonstrating those behaviours, and that's the sort of area where we need to hold a mirror up to that and challenge it, and maybe use data like 360 feedback, because it will cascade down so quickly. And if you're looking at compliance, that can absolutely expose risk if you've got that kind of autocratic, no psychological safety, example of the hospital. But the flip side of this, the sort of leadership that you want to enforce or reinforce are people who are visible and really open when they've made mistakes. They reinforce long-term thinking, and they actively encourage, challenge ethical reflection. So they're not telling off, but it's really going, what's the right thing to do? They want to do the right thing. They've got gravitas for me in that. These sort of people, they really seem wise and principled. And that's what we want in terms of that, having principles that everybody can align along. So this brings us to a natural transition here. This is the end of our high performance series, but also the beginning of something new. So I'm going to be putting out a mini series called Compliance Culture. We'll explore how culture, performance and compliance truly intersect, and we'll look at things like psychological safety versus fear-based compliance. It's not just for organisations that need compliance, but it's so important for many organisations. Most of us have got things like GDPR, or we've got regulators, things that we should be doing. So how can we get those behaviours to be worked on? How can line managers reinforce the right behaviours? We'll look at metrics, how HR and compliance can work together, the tools and systems to support it. We'll look at specific regulations and industries, and I'll get industry experts on. So while this isn't pure HR, it's an adjunct to HR. So probably what we will do is put it out on the opposite week to an HR Uprising podcast episode, so you can get it on the same feed. But also, if it takes off, we'll give it its own slot, so you could reference it to your compliance professionals if they're listening to something. Having done a little bit of homework in terms of what's out there in terms of compliance, it's pretty dry stuff. And actually, compliance is all about people, really. It's not about task, it's about whether the people follow things. So I figured it might be interesting to make it more than a compliance conversation, make it a people conversation. Don't worry, we've still got a lineup of brilliant HR Uprising guests as usual. Every other week we'll be doing those, and I'll be getting more going out as we over autumn. I'm not going to necessarily go on forever with the HR Uprising podcast, but every now and then when I think, oh, I'm going to stop, someone reaches out to me, like someone just recently reached out and said, wow, I found this series really, really useful. Thank you for it. If you have a moment to give me a review on a platform, we've just moved platforms actually, so I don't think there's any data on the new platform. I'd be so grateful, because actually I'm sitting here in my office talking into the air and wonder sometimes if anyone's listening. So if you've genuinely made it to the end and you've found it useful, or anything that we've done useful, I'd be terribly grateful if you would just leave us a review or a rating, or recommend us to someone else. Give me a shout out on LinkedIn. So thank you so much for listening. As ever, there's always going to be show notes, and there are various things I've talked about, links to cultural content, etc. So we put that on the hruprising.com page for the podcast episode, and you'll be able to get those links there if you want to download them. Thank you for joining. I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.